Welcome to Democracy Differently, the podcast about why democracy isn't working and how to fix it. I'm your host, Keith Hyams, and today I'm joined by Molly Scott Cato. Molly is an economist and a former Green Party member of the European Parliament. She's a long-time advocate for democratic and economic change. I'm going to be talking today with Molly about the need for constitutional reform in the UK. Molly, it's great to have you on the show.
Thanks very much for inviting me.
So as always, the first question that we like to ask is, in one sentence, what do you see as the biggest problem with democracy?
I think the biggest problem is that for several decades now, elected politicians are mostly working in the interests of corporations and wealthy individuals rather than in the interests of citizens. And, people have caught on to that and they're losing confidence in democracy as a system. So we need to find a way to express the sorts of changes people want to see in society better through our democratic system.
Okay, so let's talk about the UK constitution, or the lack of constitution, and how that relates to the issues you just mentioned. So first of all, can you just explain to us what the situation is with the constitution in the UK at the moment and how it would benefit from having a more codified constitution?
Well, I should start by saying that I'm not a constitutional expert. In a way, I'm a sort of user of the Constitution, both as a politician and as a citizen. I mean, I've studied politics, and I've practiced politics, and so I've really come to understand, I think, the limits of our Constitution. And the way I conceive of it, we say it's an unwritten constitution, but that's a sort of, as you implied, that's a sort of way of saying we don't have a constitution, actually. And when I think of it, it's basically about custom and practice. And I think about the sort of 18th century men in those Jane Austen type costumes, sitting in rooms filled with cigar smoke, and the ladies are next door with their frilly, lacy dresses or whatever it is. And those men are basically deciding how things might work on a sort of push and shove basis, which is to say the whole process is extremely illogical. And really, I mean, a lot of the changes that we saw in our constitution came as a result of the French Revolution and elites in this country not wanting to see similar revolutions here. And so thinking, we'd better give the masses a little bit to keep them happy, and every change that we've seen through the centuries really has been as a result of pressure on the streets, sometimes campaigning pressure. Nobody ever sat down and thought, how could we make our democracy work well? And that, I think, would be the purpose of a written constitution. We'd probably agree quite closely on what the outcomes should be, namely that democratic elections should elect people who would stand on platforms and then bring those changes in. But our system isn't really very good at making that happen. And so we apparently have a parliamentary democracy where Parliament is sovereign. But, I think we all understand that individual MPs don't have that much power, and power is exercised through the cabinet. We also have this quite strange role of the monarch. So we have the sovereign in Parliament, and that's why before the Parliament starts its session, there has to be a King's speech now, previously a Queen's speech. The monarch would go to Parliament and read out the list of bills that the government was going to introduce. So there's a sort of, an apparent political role for the sovereign, although actually the sovereign isn't allowed to have political power. So that's kind of typical of the constitutional fudge that we've got, I think. And the problem with this is when, if an MP asks, well, can I do that? Basically, they can do what they can get away with, it seems to me. And that's what led to the sort of appalling example of Boris Johnson and Jacob Rees-Mogg, kind of almost pressuring the Queen into proroguing Parliament, which means wiping out Parliament, because Parliament was moving towards stopping Brexit, actually, or having a people's vote anyway, and they didn't want that to happen. So they shut Parliament down illegally, and fortunately we now have a Supreme Court which was which could say that was illegal. But otherwise it's like, you can do it if you can get away with it. And when if MPs want to dig a bit deeper into what the Constitution is, then they resort to this book called Erskine May, which is actually only a book written by a former parliamentary clerk who just wrote down all the custom and practice that he could find. And now if anybody asks questions about whether something can be done, they go and look at this book published in 1844, which has no real constitutional standing at all. I mean, you can see how kind of just uncodified and unplanned the whole thing is. And I know, because I was in the European Parliament when all those Brexit debates were happening, and my colleagues, knowing how much I cared about that, very kindly would organise that we'd all watch it together, the proceedings from the House of Commons. And I have to say it was absolutely mortifying when people were watching what was going on. They were saying, my God, there's a guy in tights, and people with swords and 18th century costumes, really. It was like a costume drama. They were just shocked because obviously they don't normally watch the British Parliament. And they were also really surprised because, they say the eyes and the nose, and they thought that was eyes and nose. So that, anyway, that was just a linguistic confusion. But just seeing this kind of, what I was quite really affectionate about, these sort of 18th century hangovers, seeing them through modern politicians' eyes, just really brought home how much we need constitutional reform.
So if we did have a constitution, a written constitution, how do we strike a balance between having some of the rules fixed, but also having some freedom for the government of the day to make changes? So, for example, Reform UK has proposed that if they were in power, they would repeal things like the Human Rights Act and the Equalities Act. Are these the kind of things that we would be looking to enshrine in a constitution that couldn't be changed, or would that be within the scope of the government of the day to decide on?
I think that's a really good question, but I think it's really important that we distinguish between policy and constitutional, because the constitution is like a fixed legal framework within which you can then change policy, change what's happening in your country. So, most constitutions set down the powers that different bodies have and how those powers and bodies interact with each other. And then they have a fundamental statement of basic rights. And I think a modern constitution would have both those things. And then your question also takes us to this issue of the balance between domestic law and international treaties that we agree to enter into, because the level at which we're a democracy is the nation state. So the nation state should have sovereignty because that's where we're voting. That's where we're electing politicians to exercise power on our behalf. But they can also take us into treaties like the example of the European Convention on Human Rights, which can then override some of our domestic law. But we're still empowered to leave that treaty should we wish to. So it's important, I think, that we understand that now, and it always has been the case, that Parliament has remained sovereign, whatever other people might say about that. And that the constitutional protections should be there, whatever decisions are made about different international treaties.
So where are we up to in terms of achieving a written UK constitution? So in 2019, the Conservative Party manifesto promised that there would be a Constitution, Democracy and Rights Commission. What happened to that, and where are we now?
Well, I've already criticised the way that government came into being, and the prorogation of Parliament and so on. And I just think it wasn't a serious government, and things were promised and those promises were broken. That happened repeatedly, and it happened on the Constitution as well. Presumably, whoever wrote the Conservative manifesto thought people would be a bit freaked out, really, about the mess that had been going on in Parliament. So they offered this Constitution, Democracy and Rights Commission, and they just didn't really follow through on it. Although, having said that, there was some work done by the Public Administration and Constitutional Affairs Committee, which was chaired by William Ragg. And I mean, I assume that the people who were in charge of the Tory party at that time didn't want to take this agenda forward, but I actually bumped into him outside Lambeth North Station. So I had a chat with him by coincidence, and I submitted something to that review. And my assumption was he was serious about that. And he got caught in a honey trap operation, actually, and then disappeared from public life. But other than that, it seems that, that it was a promise. It was one of many manifesto promises, actually, that were broken.
So just a gimmick.
Yeah, well, I guess, well, who knows? I wouldn't like to enter into the minds of the people who were in that government, honestly. Try and imagine what they were doing and why. I'd rather not think about it. Let's just hope that's safely buried in the past, shall we?
So if we were to start from scratch and come up with a new written constitution, how would we do that? Who would be involved? How would it be done? And in particular, what role would citizens themselves have, in your view, in the writing of a constitution?
Well, I think what's really important is that this is seen to be above and beyond party politics, and that it is something that citizens have confidence in, and so that it has the authority then to be obeyed by whichever political party then is elected and holds power. So it's a job. It is a lawyer's job, and lawyers are also not always the most trusted profession. But I would suggest, we'd need a group of experts who all the political parties would say, yes, that is a person whose reputation is beyond challenge, and we would trust that person to do a good job for the country rather than for their party. And you might find some of those people actually in the House of Lords, and probably law lords, people like that. But my thinking is that while those people can do the expert constitutional work and actually do the drafting, they would need to keep very much in touch with the citizens whose constitution this would be, because we need the citizens of this country to have ownership. We're not citizens, we're subjects, aren't we, because of our crazy monarchy system. But I always consider myself a citizen and describe myself as such. And I think that's something we would have guaranteed in the constitution. And then, I think it would be good to have, say, a consultative process with citizens' assemblies, so that the people who have a rather rarefied attitude to the law could constantly keep in touch with the citizens and people who are actually going to be governed by this constitution.
What do you think would be the pitfalls in that process, and what could we do to avoid those things happening?
I think the challenge with writing a constitution is that you need something that's authoritative and will last, but at the same time it does have to be flexible enough to respond to changing social and economic conditions. And that is a challenge. If you think about, the sort of first example of this was really the US Constitution, and the founding fathers who framed that did an absolutely extraordinary job. And the US is also really good at educating its citizens about what the Constitution is and why it's important to them. Actually, they learn that in school, which we certainly don't. We don't study Erskine May, probably a good thing. But I think but you can see now it's 250 years old, the US Constitution, and you can see that it's actually now really getting to the end of its lifespan and sort of running out of steam. And that's probably not very surprising. So it's sort of inevitable that constitutions will need to be changed every now and then. But again, it's keeping that balance between a framework for governance which will have longevity and authority. So it needs to be able to have some flexibility, but not too much. So I don't think that's an easy thing to do. But I'm sure we have lawyers that are quite capable of achieving that balance.
Well, since you mentioned the US example, some people are going to worry that part of the problem we have now is that the system set up in the US has been enabling Trump to do what he's doing, and it's that fixed constitution that's part of the problem. How do we make sure that we don't end up in the same mess if we have a written constitution? The worry is that that's a counterexample to the need for a written constitution. It shows how badly wrong it can go if you get the constitution wrong.
Yeah.
What's the response to that?
I don't think it's that the constitution's wrong. I think it's that there's been, over the past 250 years, increasing abuses of the constitution. And, a constitution lasting that long is pretty impressive. And it has really reached the end of its road now and needs to be revised in various ways. For example, the original framers were very keen, because they were getting rid of George III, so they didn't want to have this despotic power, and they were very reluctant actually to have any kind of president. And in the end, it was agreed to have a president because it was going to be George Washington, and he was completely above reproach. But once it ceased to be George Washington, immediately people were concerned that that person might have too much power. And so the Constitution introduced checks and balances and a very strong Supreme Court. The thing with Trump is that he ignores the Constitution. So this is more a question of constitutional enforcement. You can have rules and laws, but if somebody comes in who's going to override those rules and laws, then you have to think of ways to enforce, and that is again a difficult problem. But all I would say in defense of the US Constitution and their real focus and pride in that Constitution is that it has given people the basis to stand up against the tyranny that Trump has been demonstrating. From the people who are just running companies, the tariffs have been abolished by the Supreme Court because ordinary Americans who ran companies knew their constitutional rights enabled them to challenge that overuse of power by the president. And there's plenty of other examples where people are citing bits of the Constitution to oppose Trump. You couldn't imagine that happening in this country. You could imagine it happening in countries that have strong constitutions that their people understand, and they understand with them. For example, in Germany, they have a part of the Constitution that's about their basic rights because it was written after Nazi Germany, and that citizens there understand they can use that if they feel their fundamental rights are being invaded. So in this country, we have absolutely no legal protections at all. Legal protections and constitutional protections can fail, but it's better to have some than none, I would argue.
So here in the UK, we're not in as extreme a position as the US, but nevertheless, there have been criticisms that power is being increasingly concentrated in the Prime Minister's office, and that parliamentary control has slipped towards kind of increased government control. Is this something that you think could be well addressed by having a written constitution here in the UK?
I think it would the process of writing a constitution would force the citizens who were involved in that process to address this question of where should power sit and how much power should sit in number 10 and in the cabinet office, because actually it's not just that power has moved from parliament to cabinet, it's that power has moved from parliament to cabinet and then on to the number 10 office and then on to a lot of people in the number 10 office who are not elected. And again, because we don't have a statement of where power should sit and who's responsible for what, we don't really have any basis on which to challenge that. And that's a process that's been going on certainly since Margaret Thatcher and was accelerated under Tony Blair. And my own view, because I worked as a legislator in the European Parliament, and my own view is that MPs should be legislators. They're not at the moment. They're effectively lobby fodder. The ministers and government write legislation and MPs are expected to just vote for it, and that their amendments are not really taken seriously as part of our system. Whereas when I was in the European Parliament, all legislation, all draft laws would come to us in the Parliament, and each of the political groups would appoint a shadow rapporteur, and that person would then introduce amendments. We would spend a lot of time debating those amendments. Every single amendment put forward by a political group would be voted on by the whole Parliament. We have electronic voting there, so it makes it possible to do that. So we were legislators, and I myself changed some pieces of European law quite significantly, much more impact on law than you'd ever have as an MP. And I think it diminishes the power of MPs and just makes them not serious. So they're spending the whole time on Twitter and, doing constituency business, fine, that's important as well. But they don't have a serious role when it comes to Parliament. And I think MPs should have that power over legislation through the committee system, which should be made more powerful than the government when it's writing law. Government has ministers and ministers run departments, and that I'm not challenging that. But I think the legislative power should sit with the legislature, which is Parliament.
Let me ask about the second chamber. So in the UK, that's the House of Lords. The government's just passed a bill to remove hereditary peers from the House of Lords. Do you think this goes far enough? And if not, what would you like to see as a second chamber in the UK?
I'm very disappointed in the government's lack of ambition when it comes to constitutional change. I mean, the fact that we still have people sitting in the House of Lords because some ancient relative came over with William the Conqueror and they got a piece of land, or during the Wars of the Roses, it's another one of those things that when you see it from the European side, you're like, oh no, it's just embarrassing, honestly, that we have those. So yeah, I absolutely think we need much more significant reform of the second chamber. I mean, the first question is whether you want a second chamber, because some of the Scandinavian democracies, for example, don't have two chambers of their parliament. But my own view is that the second chamber can play quite an important restraining function because it has a different kind of relationship to citizens from that direct elected relationship. And we could have really benefited from that during the Brexit chaos. But the House of Lords, where, there were a lot of legal experts who understood the really illegitimate things that were happening in the House of Commons, but they didn't dare intervene because they don't have that democratic mandate. So yes, I think it is important to have a second chamber, and I've got my own little plan if you'd like to hear it for how it should work.
Yeah, please.
So I like the number 3. So I'm a big one for having things in thirds, and I think it should be elected in thirds because you have that problem with you don't want the clash of democratic mandates, so you have to find a way of choosing people for the second chamber who aren't just elected from constituents with that direct democratic mandate. So I think a third could be elected on a national list and a third could be elected on regional lists, so you made sure you had good representation from across the country. And the last third I would choose via an electoral college. You can ask me who should be in the electoral college, and it's probably other peers plus senior former members of government, something like that. And the point about the final third is that a lot of the people who are in the House of Lords, some of them have been put there completely illegitimately, like Russian oligarchs, who Boris Johnson put there because he played tennis with their wives and presumably took money from them. Appalling things like that have been going on and still going on. They're still putting people in the House of Lords even today. But some of the people there do really tremendous work because they have expertise. I've already discussed the law lords, but we also have people like Lord Robert Winston, who's an expert in fertility treatment, or Tanny Gray-Thompson, who represents disabled people there. So that kind of specialist expertise, I think, is really useful in a second chamber. And you could preserve that by having these peers who were, or senators, they'd probably be called, who were chosen through an electoral college. So that's my master plan.
We'll keep that blueprint in mind. You've hinted at voting systems in talking about the second chamber, and clearly there's a lot of dissatisfaction with the first past the post. Do you think voting systems needs to be central to a constitution, and if so, what sort of voting systems would we use for these different chambers?
Look, it can't be controversial to say that in a democracy, the way people vote then gets accurately translated into the people who exercise power on our behalf, right? That is what democracy means. To me, that's like the definition of democracy, and I've never understood why people find that in any way controversial. As you say, it's becoming increasingly less controversial. There is an elections bill going through Parliament at the minute, and I know a lot of MPs are going to support first past the post. Oppose first past the post and support a fair proportional electoral system. An amendment to that bill will go through, and I can only hope that that is passed, because we're ending up in more and more chaos under first past the post. It's really, it causes so many problems. I haven't got time to go into all of them, but I think a crucial one is where I started out here. If you have a system that allows two parties to just rotate power between themselves, you get a sort of reciprocal system where they can both be as bad as they like. They don't have to worry about what citizens think or the quality of their behavior or any of that stuff, because they know if they just sit there waiting long enough, people will get fed up with the other side and they'll get their chance at power. And this has allowed the Conservatives and Labour to just not be very good for a long time. And that is a challenge to our democracy. And we've also ended up with what I think is a complete obscenity of tactical voting, where people's first question when they come to vote is not, oh, I wonder what that party might do to improve my life. It's like, who can win in my seat? I invited a friend from Germany to come over when I was campaigning in a general election a few years ago. And we went out canvassing, and when he rang on people's doors, that was always their first question: who can win here? And he was literally shocked that was what our system effectively had been reduced to, a horse race. And we just take that for granted. But again, this is the advantage of looking at our country from outside. Nobody else accepts this completely mad system. And it's people have got now so fed up with the other parties that they're not even doing the tactical voting. They're just actually voting for what they believe in. They're not prepared to vote Labour and Conservative any longer. And that means that at the next election, in every seat, it could be an almost random outcome. If you're dividing the vote between 5, sometimes 6 different parties, you've got no idea who's going to win. And this is just not a reliable way to choose a government. So yes, a system of proportional representation is desperately overdue, and I'm optimistic, more optimistic than I've ever been in my life anyway, that we might be moving in that direction now.
Great. So you've also talked about including in constitutional discussions more citizen responsiveness, more citizens' initiatives, so things like ability to recall MPs. Can you say a bit about why this is important and what impact you think it would have on actual policy decision making?
Yeah, I think citizens do need to feel that they have that person is representing them, and just once every 5 years isn't often enough. Again, you have to balance that against pernicious use of recall if people were just whipping up hatred against somebody and you were recalling people all the time. So you do need some minimum number of people in the constituency to want to change their MP. But I do think there should be strengthened powers of recall. But also, I've mentioned already the idea of a citizens' assembly, and I think it's important that politicians keep in touch with citizens and where they're at. It's easy when you're engaged in these sort of rather arcane discussions about constitutions to get distance from what ordinary people are thinking. And I think, in a democracy, the people are supposed to be sovereign, and I think we should engage them. I also think that people are much more educated and much more capable of engaging in politics at a higher level than they were, certainly in 1844 when Erskine May was written. And we should engage that enthusiasm, and we should give people more opportunities to be involved in politics and in the way the country's moving.
And let's go back to the monarchy, which you mentioned early on. So presumably this is something that would need to be included in constitutional discussions. But I expect we're going to see a deep division because people have very different views on the monarchy, potentially on its role in the constitution. How would we go about resolving those differences about the place of the monarchy in the constitution, if any, in these constitutional discussions?
It absolutely needs to be on the table. But again, I think it requires some thoughtful interventions rather than just a sort of, poll in the Guardian or whichever needs to be, it's a complex and difficult question. It needs to be thought through carefully. I personally think we've got quite a clever fudge here. A lot of our constitution is about fudging, and in many places I don't approve of it. But over the system of monarchy, I do think it's quite a clever system. Again, it's very old, goes back to 1689 when we had what we call the Glorious Revolution, which was actually a takeover by the Dutch, but let's leave that to one side. And we've got to remember that wasn't so long after the Civil War, where citizens really, and better off citizens, but anyway, let's leave that aside, were not prepared to accept what the king was doing. And we had a civil war, and we actually were the first country to cut the head off our king. So again, people were in the mood for something that felt more like compromise than what had happened in the Civil War. But it's not an easy question to answer, who should be your head of state. That's what people don't always understand about the monarch. He has a constitutional role of head of state, which is quite an important role. And his position in the constitution is not one of exercising legislative power or governing the country, but it is one of being the figurehead for the country. And I mean, I'm a Green Party person, but I'm strongly not agreeing with my party here in saying that I think it's actually quite a neat solution to the question of who should be your head of state, because a monarch who's elected in a really, who arrives in a really kind of slightly mad way of just being born into the job, has a completely different kind of authority from somebody who's elected. And so I think in times of tension and crisis, a monarch can be quite an important figurehead. And again, I think the Queen did do this during the times of Brexit. I think she did that quite skillfully, and during COVID as well. She showed real national leadership. And it's not like I hate her because I'm a red person or I hate her because I'm a blue person. Everybody can get behind the monarch if they do their job well. And so that's why I think it's quite a skillful way of solving that problem. Incidentally, there's aspects of our monarchy which I think are just as absurd as the man in tights. It's still a result of the feudal system, and the aristocracy, who are those people who picked up their land. I mean, we've got, I won't name our local toff, but he goes back even further than the Wars of the Roses. Land here and a castle. Yeah, going back to, I think it genuinely does go back to 1066 in his case. So, the massive land grab then, that's passed down through the generations. This is just anachronistic and absurd. And the same applies to the Crown Estate. There shouldn't be bits of land that just belong to the monarch. We need something more like the Scandinavian monarchies or the monarchy in the Netherlands, where they are a head of state and they do manage to exercise that authority and sense of national leadership, but they don't have all the hangers on and the vast amounts of wealth and palaces and all of that. That I think should be ended. And I think for people who oppose monarchy altogether and don't like that part of our constitution, you do have to answer the question, well, how are you going to choose the head of state then? I think it would be difficult to choose a head of state that doesn't just become a divisive figure like other politicians, and that would be a problem. The Irish, I think, have done this very skillfully. They've had a series of really good presidents who've played an important head of state role, but been able to distance themselves from the conflicts of politics. The Germans have quite a good way of choosing the head of state as well, but it's essentially to choose somebody so boring that nobody notices what they're doing. But I notice what their German president is doing, and he has done some useful things in conflictual situations that, again, a politician couldn't do. So that's what the head of state's for. And yeah, I'm not sure elections is the best way to choose that person.
And lastly, another thing you've mentioned in the context of constitutional reform is the relationship between politics and media. We've spoken to other speakers about how that relationship can distort policies and introduce short-termism and extreme views. Could you give us a picture of what an alternative to the current setup that we have might look like? What would be the options on the table in these constitutional reform discussions as to how media relates to politics?
Media is absolutely crucial to politics, and one of the threats to our democracy at the moment is the completely unregulated social media space. You can't have a democracy if people don't agree what the reality is. You know, we can disagree about how we want that reality to change, but if some people are living in a completely alternative universe that's been created through hate-fueled posts on X, then it's not possible for democracy to function. So it's absolutely crucial that we do change the way our media functions so that it's supportive of democracy. At the moment, it's definitely undermining democracy. The most important thing to do is to just strengthen the powers of Ofcom. I mean, I'm just going to say GB News, which is an obscenity. You know, it is a propaganda outlet paid for somebody who I don't think even lives in this country, where sitting politicians are allowed to have shows. All of that breaks Ofcom rules. No, the foreign ownership is a different matter. I don't think that's against the rules, but it obviously should be. But, you know, I've written to Ofcom to complain about propaganda being sent into people's homes through GB News. That Ofcom is just not prepared to act. They do have powers to act there. They're not implementing their own guidelines properly. But Ofcom also needs to be made stronger and be given the ability to recommend fines and custodial sentences, which at the moment they don't have. So we do need to regulate the media environment. Maybe not Ofcom, but some other body needs to be regulating what happens on social media. You know, we need basic rules that say, you know, stirring up racial hatred and just issuing propaganda, that the platforms should act as publishers and should be responsible for that. And if they continue to do that, they need to be shut down. Why are we allowing X to encourage the rise of fascism in our country? It's incredible that we would let that happen. And for some reason, Keir Starmer doesn't have the courage. He does have the power. He doesn't have the courage to do anything about that. Going back to more traditional media, I'm a big supporter of the BBC. Lisa Nandy is supporting the BBC today, at least rhetorically. Not sure how much she's going to do in terms of cash, but I think having a public service broadcaster that can be trusted, and I know there's all sorts of problems with the BBC, and I did submit to their charter review, and they're not doing their job as well as they should, but still, public service broadcasting is very important, because you do need a trusted outlet, and the BBC, because the world now uses English as a lingua franca, the BBC also has tremendous influence and positive influence in countries around the world. And then I think the other 2 points that are very important in terms of broadcast media and also print media are concentration of ownership. So we're seeing monopolization, not necessarily monopolization, but a smaller number of outlets, you know, now coming together, being controlled by a smaller number of people, probably all of them men. And I think we need a lot more diversity of media ownership, and we shouldn't allow any of the significant broadcast or print media outlets to be owned by somebody who doesn't live in this country. So I think if you changed all those rules and gave enforcement powers to Ofcom to make sure they weren't broken, we'd be well ahead of where we are now.
Okay, thank you, Molly. So a round of quick-fire questions. If I can ask you to answer in maximum of one sentence or less. Firstly, if you could abolish one UK political institution tomorrow, what would it be?
So I'm going to say the City Remembrancer. Do you know who he is?
No.
So this is another one of those ancient history things that we haven't got rid of. It dates back to 1571. He actually comes from the City of London Corporation, so what we now call the City, the financial centre, and he has a special place in the House of Commons, just near the Speaker's chair, and his job is to act as a channel of communication, apparently, between what happens in Parliament and the City of London, which gives them a particular power to make sure that laws don't go against their interests. That's a anachronism and an outrage, so we'll get rid of that role.
That seems fishy. Second, should ordinary citizens have the power to initiate national referendums?
Absolutely not. We don't have a place in our unwritten constitution for referendums, and the referendums we've had been disastrous, full of misinformation and empty prospectus. If you're going to have a referendum, you've got to be really clear about what people are actually voting for, not should we be members of the EU or not, but what leaving the EU would actually mean, for example. I was active in that campaign. I was also active in the AV campaign, and similar misinformation abounded. So there's no coincidence that there's almost no scope for referendums in the German constitution, because the Nazis used them very skillfully to undermine democracy in the 30s, and I think they can be used today for that reason. So I wouldn't give them any place in our constitution.
Okay. Should we have a prime minister who's directly elected by the public?
No, I think my earlier comments about elected head of state apply here as well. I think the majority party in Parliament, the party that has the most seats, rather, not the majority party, the party that has the most seats after the election, have the right to try to form a government and put forward a prime minister. I think it's the system of primus inter pares, first among equals, I think works well in theory, although, as we've already discussed, in recent years, the prime minister's been taking too much power. Let's put it all on the table. Let's have a constitutional convention and discuss if we want to move towards a presidential system. I personally don't. But if you had a presidential system, you'd have to make lots of changes as well. Just electing the prime minister outside any other discussions wouldn't work.
Okay, what country should a written UK constitution most seek to emulate?
I think you know what I'm going to say here, because I've referred quite a few times to the German constitution. I am a bit of a nerd when it comes to this, but I am a great fan of the German constitution. And the reason it's good is that at the end of the Second World War, Germany was, it was an indoctrinated country. Most people were Nazis. They didn't think democracy was a good idea. So lawyers, a lot of them American and British lawyers, sat down to write a constitution that would convince German citizens that democracy was a good idea and would work for them. So unsurprisingly, they came up with a good constitution, and I would happily import a constitution along those lines. At the beginning, it has the basic rights, which again protects you against the sort of appalling depredations of Nazism, and then it moves on to say how power is shared, and that's what I think a constitution should do.
And lastly, where do you see the most hope for reforming democracy in the UK today?
I think our democracy is really in trouble, and the fact that a third of people in this country are willing to vote for a party which, whether overtly or covertly, would undermine democracy, if not overthrow it altogether, is deeply troubling. But surely we should see hope there, in that other politicians see that as well, and it should focus minds. And my own ideal solution would be that decent politicians who don't want to see a fascist government, which is what I think reform would be, should agree a platform for basic constitutional reform, free voting, some constitutional reform of the House of Lords, and a proposal to produce a fully written constitution. They should agree that, and everybody should put that equally in their manifestos. And then when the negotiations after the election happened, there would already be agreement on what constitutional reform should look like. That would be my ideal. But whether we get that or not, I think certainly if Greens are involved in those discussions, I'm sure we will have some of these significant constitutional reforms on the table. And I think the threat from reform is so great that it does actually create an opportunity to solve some of these problems that date back to maybe 1066, but certainly 1689 or 1844, hundreds of years we haven't resolved this. Maybe there's going to be an opportunity to do that now.
Yeah. At the beginning of the episode, we asked you to consider what was the biggest problem with democracy. And given that we've discussed in one sentence, can you tell us one thing, if you had to pick for democracy to do differently, what would it be and why?
I think we need a democracy that's genuinely competitive, and more parties would be good, because at the moment oligarchs are buying off politicians and people can see that, and it's undermining their confidence in democracy. So if we had an open system, genuinely competitive with more parties, those parties would be actually under a lot more pressure to work for citizens than they are now.
Molly, thank you so much for coming.
Thank you. Thank you for asking me to talk about the Constitution, which you can tell I really enjoyed.
Pleasure. It's been really interesting. We hope you've all enjoyed the podcast. If you have, please do remember to subscribe and follow us on social media. I've been your host, Keith. Thanks for tuning in.